The following program is brought to you in part by the film Backdoor Channels, The Price of Peace.
Welcome to another Leon Charney Report. We have a really eclectic and exciting show tonight.
My name is Sarah Fainberg. I'm originally from France and I have worked in the United States for a few years. And I made Aliyah 2 years ago, and since then I'm working at the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm a daughter of a couple of Soviet dissidents who were expelled from the former Soviet Union in the 1970s. My dad was in prison, in a psychiatric prison, for 5 years. And so I grew up in a milieu of Soviet human rights defenders and dissidents in Paris. Yeah, I taught at Columbia University, and I was a visiting fellow at the Harriman Institute at Columbia, and then I taught as a visiting professor at Georgetown University. So there are a few reasons for this sudden intervention of Russia in Syria. First of all, this was a very carefully prepared operation. This is the kind of operation that has been prepared for months with the Russian military establishment and security establishment, and I do believe that it was a plan B. It was a plan B that Russia prepared on the table in case the situation on the ground deteriorates and in case there was a significant weakening of Assad's stronghold in Syria. And that's exactly what happened. What we've seen in the course of September was a weakening of the Assad regime that controls no more than 30% of the greater Syria, of the integral Syrian state. And Russia, in light of the retreat of the Assad forces, decided to intervene. Why is it important? Because Syria is the first stronghold of Russia in the Middle East, especially since the Iranians have signed an agreement with a P5+1, meaning that Russia is expecting a rapprochement between Iran and the United States and is afraid of being avoided in this new partnership that Iran is creating with the West, basically. So for Russia, it was very important to keep the stronghold alive. It's important as a competitor to the United States on the Middle Eastern scene. It's important to keep the naval base of Tartus, which is the only Russian base on the Mediterranean. And it was also important from a domestic point of view. As you know, in Russia, there is a power struggle within the Kremlin, and Putin is not in a strong position at the moment. He's been challenged because of the economic sanctions, and for him it's very important to gain some political capital, some political dividends in face of competitive groups within the Kremlin. Russian foreign policy is always a result of Russian internal struggles, internal political struggles. And when you see that there is an escalation, whether in Ukraine or in Syria, it is very often the result of an internal conflict between Putin's clans and alternative clans. One of these clans is the clan of the military industrial complex. And this is a clan that pushes forward for stronger military intervention of Russia, whether in Ukraine or in the Middle East. Syria is a very old Soviet ally. Okay, so there is a very strong historical and political relationship that has lasted for more than 40 years. Second, as I've mentioned, Syria is the only country where not only you have Russian spies all over the country, and we know here in Israel that the Golan Heights are completely infiltrated with Russian spies, but it is also a country with a very strong Russian military presence. Since the beginning of the civil war in Syria, back in 2011, Russia has supplied Syria with fighter jets, with advisors, with drones, with all kinds of defense equipment for the entire period of the civil war. For Russia, supporting Assad today is a way to keep and to strengthen what we call in Israel the radical axis, or the Shiite axis, the axis of Tehran, Damascus, and Hezbollah. And despite the fact that Russia is trying to mitigate its alliances and seduce the Sunni states at the same moment, it is playing at the moment when we're talking, it is playing the Shiite card in order for many different reasons that we can discuss at the moment. Since the Soviet period, the Middle East, whether in Egypt, before the Russians were kicked out, or in Syria, this was a region with a lot of Russian spies, and this explains the extreme sophistication and the advanced knowledge of the Russians that the Russians have of the Middle East. If you look at the Soviet school or the Russian school of Middle Eastern studies and the American school, you see that Russia is a country that is much stronger because of this infiltration of Soviet and Russian spies at the time. There is a misconception in the United States about Putin's support of Bashar al-Assad. His support is not an unconditional support. Russia has made clear that this was a murderous regime, that this one of the most brutal regime ever in the Middle East. Russia has made clear that it doesn't support Bashar al-Assad per se. It does support the integrity and the sovereignty of a secular Syrian state. At the moment, it means supporting Bashar al-Assad, but in principle, it doesn't mean supporting this personality, this dictator per se. And I believe that the Saudis and the Americans are making a mistake, or maybe are overstating this for political purposes. Now, it is not in the interest of Russia today to support Assad per se, because it does alienate Russia from the partnerships it has created over the years with the Sunni states, like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. It does also infringe upon the possibility of having a political solution in Syria, and that's what Russia is looking for. Russia, at this juncture, is looking for a rapid political settlement of the Syrian conflict. And for them, being able to compromise on Assad, meaning a restriction of his sovereignty or his full exit from the Syrian scene, enables the Syrian moderate opposition to come to the negotiation table and then hasten a political dialogue and a political solution in Syria. And this is Russia's goal at the moment. On the ISIS question, ISIS became a problem of strategic dimension for Russia only back in June 2015. Prior to this date, the Russian official position is that the Islamic State doesn't represent a strategic threat for the world, nor for Russia itself, for the Russian Federation. We've seen a drastic change in June, which was related to the declaration of the Emirate Caucasus, declaration of obedience of the Emirate Caucasus, which is a territory that is located in the Caucasus. They declared their obedience to ISIS. And what we've seen in the Caucasus was a shift of Islamist fighters from Al-Qaeda to Daesh, to the Islamic State. So we've seen over the years the mounting of the influence of ISIS in this area. And since this declaration, Putin's official position was to say that ISIS became a strategic threat for Russia. Remember that Russia is home to 20 million Muslim citizens, most of whom are Sunnis, out of a population of 147 million Russian citizens. Remember that there is a drastic radicalization of Muslims not only in the Caucasus, but also in the Volga and the Ural regions of Russia, which are homes to traditional moderate Islam, and now we see the rise of terrorist activities in these areas. So basically, since this period, Russia has called for the creation of an alternative coalition against ISIS, a coalition that would be much more efficient than the coalition that was built upon by the United States. And basically, they created this coalition by entering into Syria. What is this coalition about? It gathers together Russia, the Syrian army of Bashar al-Assad, the Iraqis are giving political backing. They're not militarily involved, but they're giving political backing. And the Iranians, at this stage, there are approximately 3,000 Iranian fighters located in Syria, and Shiite militants coming from Afghanistan and from other parts of the world. So Russia has created de facto this ground and air defense coalition against ISIS. Now we're talking together a few days after the crash. It is interesting to mention that the Russian media and the Russian official position has been very careful in terms of qualifying this event, in terms of defining it or not as a terrorist attack committed by ISIS. What does it mean? It means that Russia is today at a crossroads, and that the Russians are preparing a counter strategy. And they have a dilemma. They have to choose today. If ISIS, which seems at this stage likely, at least according to British and Israeli intelligence, and the Americans recorded conversations by the Russians who have acknowledged among themselves that it was most probably ISIS. The dilemma is as follows. Either launch a big ground operation into Syria and present this operation as a justification for the Syrian intervention. And you know that the Syrian intervention has been condemned based on the fact that most of the Russian strikes were not conducted against ISIS, but against other groups, some of which are fighting ISIS on the ground, such as the Syrian moderate opposition. So either it will use it as a justification to launch a major ground operation, or, which I believe at this stage is the most likely scenario, it will hasten a political settlement of the Syrian conflict and try to find a political solution to the expansion of ISIS. It could be as follows. The Russians, as you know, initiated and participated in two major conferences in Vienna, one that took place on October 23rd and the other one on October the 30th. And the idea is to call for a transition government in Syria. They've called just this morning for a transition period of 18 months. They even agreed that this transition period could be without Bashar al-Assad. Without Bashar al-Assad. So the Russians are not ready to die for Bashar al-Assad. And in this new Syria, you have a few options, and the Russians are not clear about the map. Officially, they call for the preservation of a viable, secular, integral Syrian state with a few autonomous regions inside, like a Kurdish autonomous region, an Alawite region, and a Sunni region. The borders that we're having today. So this is the official position. In this map, in this ideal and highly unlikely map, ISIS would get a mini-state within the Syrian state. And the Russian thinking goes as follows: let's keep a Sunni state and clear it from its most difficult terrorist elements. So we will institutionalize ISIS in a way and send all these terrorists out of the country. So this is one scenario. Another scenario that I think is more likely to happen is to say, let's preserve an Alawite state, either a restricted Alawite state with minimal borders, or an extended Alawite state, which would include Aleppo and which would be much larger than the territories that are currently controlled by Bashar al-Assad, and let's just contain ISIS. So you would have a Kurdish state in that situation, which would anger the Turks, but the Russians have called for the creation of a Kurdish state, and I believe Israel is not against. And then you would have this limbo, this kind of proto-terrorist state, and the Russians would say, we've done our part, now it's time for the world to unite and contain ISIS. We cannot defeat ISIS, but we can contain ISIS. In that case, what is good for Russia? Russia would have demonstrated its military strength, because the Syrian operation is all about showing to the world how Russia is advanced in terms of its military production, because it was a kind of military theater to the world. And remember that the main Russian business in the Middle East is arms sales. So for the Russians, it's highly important. And it would have preserved its strongholds in Syria. It would have created a unique combination that never existed during the Soviet period, meaning having an air base, Latakia, that exists alongside a naval base on the Mediterranean. So for the Russians, this is a very strong accomplishment that they will never relinquish, abandon. And they would have hastened a political solution in Syria. What it means for the Russians, it means that they would have a very strong negotiating card to hasten a political solution in Ukraine. And remember that the end game for the Russians is not Syria, is not even the Islamic State, even though you have more than 5,000 fighters from the former Soviet states who are currently fighting in Syria and Iraq. The final game is about Ukraine. It's finding a settlement in Ukraine that will preserve Russian interests and that will achieve the lifting of economic sanctions in Russia. Because the economic sanctions at this very moment are not only a threat to the Russian economy, they're a threat to the very stability of Putin's regime. Technically, he could remain in power for many years forward until at least 2020. He could run for another term. But the problem is, and we've seen tangible signs this past year, especially after the murder of Boris Nemtsov, of the Russian oppositionist Boris Nemtsov, we've seen signs of a growing internal instability in Russia. And this instability is, of course, triggered by the economic sanctions. And actually, it was the main American agenda. The main American agenda was not only about hurting the Russian economy, it was about creating a leverage inside the Kremlin to have the Russians surrender to American pressure. I would like someone to explain to me what the US policy is all about in Syria vis-à-vis Putin. I believe it's a big mystery at the moment, and it's probably a mystery to many American experts. With regard to Putin, it is crystal clear that the Americans are taking him seriously. The first reason is that Putin introduced a game changer in Syria. And they've changed completely the game for the Western coalition. The Americans are sending ambivalent messages vis-à-vis Putin's policy in Syria. On the one hand, they do support the Russian initiative against ISIS. And they're ready, to a certain extent, to collaborate with the Russians should the Russian operation prove successful. At this stage, it's not successful. It's not so successful. On the other hand, they're condemning the Russian operation for weakening the Syrian moderate operation. And as you know, the Americans have sent a few days ago 50 special units in order to better equip and strengthen the Syrian moderate opposition. So yes, the Americans are taking the Russians seriously, but they do know that the key lies in the hands. What is the key that the Americans have? This is the economic sanctions. And without the lifting of the sanctions, without the guarantee that NATO will not further expand eastwards on the former Soviet territories, to Georgia, to Ukraine, these are the key countries, Russia cannot really remain the kind of empire, the kind of superpower it aspires to be.
We got here with ISIS because of a whole series of events in the region. Personally, I would date it back to the emergence of Hezbollah, Shiite, no connection with ISIS, which is militantly Sunni Muslim. But the unhinging of non-state actors, their move starting around that moved us to the point of getting our Marines out of Lebanon back in 1984, early 84. The bombing of the embassy, which had preceded that in 83. A series of acts of non-state actors ready to commit major acts of violence and proving their effectiveness against a country such as ours with the superpower status and the great military strength that we have. This asymmetric warfare that we today see with ISIS, which is so far holding its own. We claim to be containing it and shrinking the area that it controls in eastern Syria and northern Iraq there. But we haven't defeated it. We haven't destroyed it. And I think that whole language needs to be revisited, that started when we were going to go into action and get rid of ISIS. Anyway, along the road, the violence between Palestinians and Israelis, the effectiveness of violence on political decision-making was steadily reinforced. Now, ISIS, or the Islamic State, whatever we agree to call it, started probably with Qaeda. It's a different breed of cat from Qaeda because it doesn't recognize borders. Qaeda has been very happy to fight the good fight as he sees it, as they see it in Afghanistan, And they have units outside in Yemen and Libya today. But they appear to think in terms of national boundaries are still a legitimate consideration. ISIS, no, we're going to go back to the earliest days when there were no boundaries and when Islam was a world conqueror that was going to sweep over much of the then known world outside of what's Western Europe today. The roots, various commentators have talked about the disenfranchisement of the young, the fact that there's a youth bulge throughout the Arab world without jobs, with often a very tenuous existence, who feel no particular loyalty to a government that has done, without listing them by name, so few of them have done anything that is appreciated by their population as in their interest as individuals. So it's picked up an appeal. You can play a role. You can destroy major powers. Look at the world. They are now gathering in Vienna. They're gathering in Istanbul. World leaders up against the Islamic State. Just a taste of what's to come. Now, it's a hokey appeal, and I don't think in the long run it's going to survive. It's a revival of a cult which has not just been present in Islamic circles. I mean, we've seen it in Christianity as well. But its promises are huge for the role that you as an individual can play in it. And the fact is, you have brought Obama to his knees, Cameron to his knees, Hollande. We've just done this in Paris. Great success stories. And the world is terrified of us. Well, there's something to be said for their interpretation. We are afraid. We are terrified by their terror, which has been so basic and brutal. The beheadings of the journalists, of the aid technicians, of the soldiers from Iraq, soldiers, regular army from Syria, burning alive the Jordanian pilot. They have done a pretty darn good job of selling themselves as world-class power, the power of the idea. This is payback time, payback for the insults that Islam has suffered at the hands of the West, in the payback for the bombings that have gone on for years in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now in Syria. I think all of this is at work right now in their minds. ISIS will be delighted to say, is happy to say today, it is virtually said words like this, that we are the defenders of Islam against the Crusaders who are at it again. Look what they're doing to Muslims all over the Muslim world. We're the defender. And follow us. The regimes of the Arab Muslim countries are hopeless. They're ineffective. We're something vital that will restore the glories that were ours several hundred years ago, and will bring them back. That's a terrific sales pitch if you're young, excitable, and very disturbed by the use of these major weapon systems that the West, now Russia, is deployed against fellow Muslims. So they're happy to pose as the best defense of Islam. Assad, I think Jimmy Carter said it in his op-ed about a month ago, is a very stubborn man, and he inherited that from his father, Hafez al-Assad. Their attitude in times of trouble is just be patient. The world will come to see our worth and the world's need of us. Again, going back to the 80s and 90s, Hafez al-Assad was the odd man out in the Arab world. He styled himself the leader of the steadfast and resistance front. Sadat laughed at him. Mubarak felt the same way, laughing and irritated with the presumption. But, he waited, and the world didn't come around and haunt him over the destruction of his own city in Hama in 1982. And the world has been slow to react to what to do about his son, Bashar, until this past year. Various people have said he should go. I think President Obama said it's time for Assad to step aside. Well, he wasn't about to step aside. Assads don't give up their job. Their interest is in survival and maintaining a system which has worked with brutality and efficiency for 40 years, more than 40 years. We are currently very complimentary about the Kurds. They fight well, but the Kurds fight for their own existence and their own future, many of whom see in the present turmoil the chance that one of these days, that they're getting closer to the day when they just might get their own state. In any case, they're going to come out with greater autonomy in whatever is reconstructed out of Iraq and Syria. Turks cannot control the Kurds across the border as effectively as they have shown they can do inside Turkey. The Erdogan regime has actually had some pretty good success co-opting the Kurds until Erdogan lost his extra votes in the parliament in the elections a few months ago, which he has in effect now regained his status. But he was making nice with the Kurds, and he was attracting a good many of the Kurds to a better life within Turkey. But he has an enemy, as he's quick to point out, in the PKK and in Iraq, what's called I think it's the YPD in Syria, and inside Turkey itself, there are elements of the Kurds who are very hostile to his leadership and to living within Turkey. But he has less elbow room in managing the Kurds across the line in Iraq and Syria than he does within Turkey. We have acted on the assumption that there is a large moderate element which has survived in Syria, which is none of the above. That they're the ones we tried to train outside, no success there. The handful that went back. Now we're sending in a few special operations personnel to work out a better coordination between various military factions of the moderates and with the Kurds, for example. And we can do something to improve the coordination inside Syria. But there's hundreds of military factions in Syria today. It's a real nightmare, which we have tried to tame into in forming an opposition to the regime, which would appear to the Syrian people as a viable opposition with its own program. If we come to power, we will, or when we come to power, they're confident they will, we will provide the following program. That really hasn't happened between the political leaders who have been largely exiled, and they meet up in Turkey, they meet in Qatar, but they have not put together an effective cooperation between themselves. So we do recognize that we want to avoid a repeat of Iraq, where we went in and issued some edicts like the Ba'ath Party is hereby dissolved, and no Ba'ath Party senior official, at least, will have a role in the future of Iraq. The Iraqi army is today dissolved. You can go home. Yeah, you can take your guns with you, but you're finished. We will rebuild. There will be a new Iraq. It's not been a success story. And with that example staring at us today in Iraq, the last thing we want to do is try a repeat action in Syria. So, you saw the gathering in Vienna, the countries that created Syria and Iraq at the time of the First World War, drawing lines on a map, nice, clear, straight lines in a very curveball atmosphere. You had the supporters of the Assad regime. The Iranians were there, the Russians were there. You did not have Hezbollah there. You did not have you didn't have Syrians there, basically. Now they're meeting again, and they've set some kind of deadline, I think of January, to agree on a list of factions, parties that should be in the new regime. The elephant in the room is Bashar al-Assad. He's got his supporters in Moscow and Tehran, and we don't agree on that. We have modified our position from saying in October 2011, it's time for Bashar to step aside, to saying, well, we're not saying he has to leave office right away. He could be part of the transition, but there's no role for him as the future leader of Syria. Now, I've heard arguments, including one quite colorful comment by a prominent Iranian. I mean, what you Americans and Assad's enemies are doing is asking a leader to dig his own grave. Leaders don't do that, and he's got a point. But he's dug the grave of hundreds of thousands of Syrians. He has led a regime from which millions have fled. They're not all his enemies, and that was one of our mistakes at the beginning. We didn't think he had any supporters, just those he could control, a nucleus of Alawis and perhaps some of the Sunnis. But he has supporters, people who have known only his father and himself as leaders, who are afraid of what might come afterwards. I mean, would it be the Islamic State? Hey, they don't want that. And they have watched the various politicians who haven't been tied to Assad fight with each other. Syrians have not had a great record of cooperating with one another in quieter times. And there are those who are loyal out of fear for what may happen to their communities, like the Alawis, if Assad is pushed out. So what formula can be devised? I don't know. I'll be frank. I don't know. I know what we say we want at the end of the day, which is a new regime without Assad. How do we get there? How do we persuade the Russians, the Iranians, and his supporters domestically that they have nothing to fear for their own interests? And the Russian interests may be easier for us to handle than the Iranian interests with their concerns about supporting the Alawi, the Shia, supporting the Hezbollah group in Lebanon, having a bridge from Tehran through Baghdad, Damascus to Beirut. An awful lot of questions confront these guys that are sitting trying to work out a new arrangement. I think Putin is a very clever tactician, very adept at sticking his finger in our eye. I don't know that he has a strategy which can restore Russia to former greatness. That's to the golden days, as they would look back on, at least some of them, to the days of the Soviets, or before that to the better czars. On paper, he doesn't have the resources. The price of oil has run against him. The sanctions have run against him. His isolation, because of what he did in Crimea, is still being held against him. But he wants to show that Russia is not a minor power, and he's doing a pretty good job of that. Is there a basis to cooperate with Russia? I'm sure there is. They are obviously afraid. They are terrified. They wouldn't use the word perhaps, but of the extreme Muslims within Russia. And they have gone to some trouble and expense to crush them, and they have not been crushed. They've not been liquidated. Many of them have died, but there's still a large number there who, reinforced by events in Syria and Iraq, many of them have been participating in the struggle. They'll come home, and they'll come home with some new zeal to improve the lives of fellow Chechens, for instance. So he's worried about that, and that's grounds for finding a way to cooperate with us against the Islamic State. The downing of the Russian plane a few weeks back reminded him, if he needed that, about the menace of having an enemy like those fellows on the loose in Syria and Iraq. So I think there are grounds to work with him. I'm not worried about Russia becoming a major military power on the Mediterranean. I don't think that's in the cards. They're able to do more than we thought. They pulled off a nice imitation of our shock and awe campaign against Baghdad, if you remember the opening days before we invaded Iraq, when they sent cruise missiles over Iran and Iraq to hit targets, or try to hit targets in Syria with cruise missiles. Nice example of a reinvigorated Russian military. But they're not a major military power, and there are limits on their economy, on their military strength, although he is ready to devote a certain amount of new blood to his campaign to restore Russia as a serious player. And he has an old relationship. Long before he was in power, there were Russian military exchanges with Syria, aid programs with Syria. But I've never forgotten the comment to me by the Soviet ambassador in Damascus when I arrived in '74. He said, "I know you've come convinced that this country is one that'll do exactly what we want it to do, that it's our puppet." Well, keep this in mind. The Syrians have accepted from us money, grants, loans, military equipment. In fact, I would say they've accepted everything from us except advice. And I've kept that in mind as we look at the Russian-Syrian relationship in 2015. The day is going to come when Russia will push for something which the Syrian leadership isn't willing to do.